Hello, my name is Deb Fuster and I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Victorian Council of Social Service, VCOSS. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I am today, the Wurundjeri people, and pay respects to elders and ancestors. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay respects to any Aboriginal colleagues who are joining us for this webinar today. So thank you so much for joining us for another edition of our Renters' Rights Rundown series for 2025. These events are for you, for frontline community sector workers to learn more about or just refresh your memory on Victoria's renting rules, which is set out in the Residential Tenancies Act. In recent years, Victoria has experienced some of the most devastating disasters in our post-colonial history: the 2019-20 bushfires, the 2022 floods, significant storms, and the recent Western Victorian bushfires. And many of these disasters have impacted areas with high numbers of renters who are already dealing with insecure, unaffordable housing. So that's why today, with this latest edition of our Renters' Rights Rundown series, we're going to be looking at the integral role that housing plays in disaster recovery. And what we're really going to specifically look at is the unique challenges that renters who are experiencing disasters come up against in terms of knowing their rental rights, exercising their rental rights, and enforcing their rental rights. We're going to do a deep dive into the experiences of renters during and post-disaster in today's session. And we're really going to look at three components. So firstly, we're going to delve into the impacts of disasters and the recovery journey for renters following a major disaster. Secondly, we're going to look at the current provisions for renters experiencing disasters under the Residential Tenancies Act. And we're going to look at what's out of the Act's scope. And thirdly, we're going to look at how does the Residential Tenancies Act apply in practice. And we're going to do that by talking through a few case study illustrations that really help shine a light on the strengths of the Residential Tenancies Act and the limitations of the Residential Tenancies Act in safeguarding renters' rights following a major disaster. Looking at those limitations as well as the strengths, looking at what's out of the Act's scope, in many ways is as important as looking at what's in scope and also like what's strong and what's working well, because as frontline workers, knowing what works and like what's out of scope and what's not working so well is just as important, because it helps you identify where are the opportunities, where do we kind of need extra support, including future waves of further legislative and regulatory reform. This is a session, as I mentioned, for frontline community sector workers, and it's for anyone who's working in the community services system that comes across vulnerable renters. It's not just a session for people working in tenancy support programs directly, for people working in the CLC sector, although this session is also for you. It really is for everyone from anyone who's working in information services, referral services, emergency relief, material aid, family violence response, the list goes on, disability advocacy. If you're supporting renters in some way, if you're got a touch point with renters, we want to make sure that you know helpful things about the Residential Tenancies Act that ensure that you can impart and share that knowledge to people that you're supporting, whether it's direct support, whether it's information and referral. It's about providing them with information about what their rights are, supporting them to assert their rights, and referring them to specialised supports where this is needed. So we have four special guests with us today who are going to step us through that content. Firstly, we have our own Lucy Mann, who is VCOSS's Disaster Resilience Policy Advisor. And Lucy is going to take us through a statewide picture of disaster recovery and renting and really provide that disaster resilience context for Victoria. So that's really good scene setting that we're going to have from Lucy. Lucy's then going to be followed by Amanda Howard, the team manager for emergency recovery support from Gippsland Lakes Complete Health. And Amanda is really going to focus on talking us through the unique challenges that renters face in the context of disasters in terms of like what her organisation sees and works on, and importantly, talk us through those necessary community supports that are required to ensure that renters can recover from disaster. And we know from like our work that some of the best and most effective responses to vulnerable renters, to people experiencing difficulties in the wake of disasters is where we've got those legal supports knitted together with social and community supports, and tenancy advocacy is obviously like part of that mix as well. And lastly, we have Kate Clohesi and Anna Dorovich from ARC Justice. Kate is the Director of Strategy and Impact at ARC Justice, and Anna is the Managing Lawyer of the Housing Justice team at ARC Justice. And Kate and Anna are going to provide us with a legal deep dive into what renters' current rights are under the RTA, how they applied in practice, and the barriers that renters face in exercising their rights. And once these presentations conclude, I'll be back with you to provide some closing remarks. So really happy for us to get stuck in now. And please join in welcoming Lucy from VCOSS. Thank you, Lucy.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to take a few minutes now to share a little bit about the current disaster resilience context in Victoria and some of the impacts for renters. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that I'm here today on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders and ancestors. I'll start with just a little bit about VCOSS's role in disaster resilience. So as Deb mentioned, community organisations play a really crucial role before, during and after disasters. Community organisations are deeply embedded in Victorian communities and highly trusted, and so often it's to our sector that people turn in times of crisis. We know that community organisations are particularly important in supporting those who are the most impacted by disasters, which is often people experiencing poverty and disadvantage. At the same time, we know the community sector's role in emergencies is not always fully recognised and resourced, and disasters are becoming more frequent and severe. And so our work at VCOSS focuses on 3 key areas. So that includes supporting peer learning and capacity building within the sector, also consulting with community organisations to look at policy development and advocacy, and thirdly, playing a liaison role between state-level emergency management processes and community organisations. And as part of this, we convene a disaster resilience network for community organisations, which Deb mentioned, and you can have a look on the website with this video, and there'll be a link to join up to that. So the conversation today on renters' rights is a really important part of building a more disaster resilient Victoria, and especially addressing some of the unequal impacts of disasters. And so there's a few key reasons for this. So firstly, we know that disasters are becoming more frequent and severe due to climate change, and they're also now often overlapping and compounded by other crises. Secondly, we know that impacts on housing and being able to return to a stable home is a really important part of the overall recovery journey and healing after disasters. Thirdly, we know that renters in particular face disproportionate impacts. And finally, these disproportionate impacts they have consequences not only for renters, but also the community as a whole. So I'll share just a little bit about each of these points today to help set the scene for the discussion. So as Deb mentioned, in recent years, Victoria has experienced some really devastating disasters, including floods, storms, and bushfires. And these disasters have damaged and destroyed thousands of homes. And this has included more than 400 homes destroyed in the 2019-20 bushfires. Then in 2021, 500 homes were destroyed due to storms. We then had more than 5,000 buildings damaged or destroyed in the 2022 floods. And then another 46 homes were destroyed in Western Victoria bushfires in 2024. And of course, these numbers don't really tell the story of how disasters are impacting on Victorians, particularly in regional areas. And so I'll just share one example. So of the 46 homes destroyed in the February 2024 Western Victoria bushfires, there were 45 in the town of Pomonal, which is near Garryword or the Grampians. So this represents almost a quarter of the entire town of Pomonal. And it happened in a region where rental vacancy rates were extremely low at that time at 0.79%. And then just a few months later, in December 2024, this region was hit by fires again. And although these fires didn't destroy homes, there was significant trauma that was felt by communities when they had to evacuate through the holiday period. And then these fires had a huge impact on cultural heritage, the environment, and the tourism industry. And so this demonstrates how the crises have been overlapping and compounding and interacting with the rental crisis, and we're seeing this more and more across the state. And climate projections suggest that these disasters are set to become more severe over time. So according to the Victorian Government's most recent climate modelling, bushfires are already more frequent and severe due to climate change, and this is very likely to worsen. Extreme floods are also expected to get worse. So there's a trend of small floods becoming smaller, but large floods becoming larger and more devastating. And extreme heat is a disaster that we won't talk about as much today, but this is also a huge issue for renters and is also becoming worse in Victoria due to climate change. And so housing being destroyed or damaged is one of the biggest impacts from disasters, and it causes significant trauma and psychosocial impacts, as well as financial impacts. And the research tells us that returning to a stable home is an important part of the healing process following a disaster. Some of the consequences of housing being damaged or destroyed includes displacement from communities into temporary accommodation, and often this is for many years. And this accommodation can be unsafe or unsuitable. So for instance, following the 2022 floods, motel rooms and caravans were the primary source of emergency housing. And then VCOSS consultation with community organisations found that these facilities were often overcrowded, they weren't equipped with cooking and laundry facilities, they were not always safe for family violence survivors, and they weren't always accessible for people with mobility restrictions. And temporary housing can also often be located outside of a community. This causes a loss of social connection, it can increase transport costs and impact on work and study opportunities. And then beyond this displacement into temporary accommodation, and there's also significant power imbalances in the rebuilding process. This can be between community members and their landlords, can be with insurers, council, and other government agencies. And so for all of these reasons, being able to return as quickly as possible to a stable and safe home is in one's own community, and to have some choice and agency through that process, it's extremely important to the overall recovery journey. And supporting this transition is one of the key roles that the community sector plays in the recovery process by providing supports to help people, and particularly those experiencing poverty and disadvantage, to navigate this process. And so today we'll hear a bit more about legal assistance and case support work, and other really important supports for housing recovery often include financial counselling, specialist family violence services, women's health, and multicultural organisations. So housing recovery is challenging for everyone, and especially for people experiencing poverty and disadvantage, and renters face really disproportionate and particular barriers. And so this can be broken down into 3 risk factors. So firstly, renters may be more likely to experience disasters affecting their homes in the first place. So this is because rentals are more likely to be in at-risk areas, and we know there's a correlation between spatial disadvantage and being located in more flood-prone and bushfire-prone areas. And this can become more pronounced over time if owners choose to move and then rent out housing in these areas rather than selling, particularly if properties are losing value. In general, rentals tend to be lower quality homes in terms of their resilience. And renters also often lack information about the potential risks of disasters facing their rental, because landlords don't need to disclose this information at the point of lease. And even if this information is available, the lack of affordable rentals and availability means that many renters have little choice but to live in disaster-prone areas or in housing that is not resilient. And this particularly impacts renters in regional areas and on lower incomes. Secondly, we know that renters may have less capacity or ability to build resilience to disasters. So renters have less control over housing to make it more resilient. And it's important to remember this can extend to even the most basic things. So for instance, many renters report not having fly screens, and how this is a big issue during summer heat. Insurance is also a huge issue in at-risk areas, with rates of non-insurance and underinsurance increasing. And this is the choice of the landlord rather than the renter, but it's one of the most critical factors in whether a house can be repaired or rebuilt. Renters are also more likely to be lower income earners, so there are less financial resources to build resilience. And as we'll hear a lot more about today, where renters do have rights, they face barriers exercising them due to unequal power dynamics. And finally, renters are potentially more sensitive to the impacts of disasters, because they're more likely to be from cohorts that are at higher risk. And as one example, people with a disability from 25 to 65 are significantly more likely to be renters. And people with certain disabilities are also amongst the most at risk from some disasters due to systemic injustices in the way that we manage emergencies. And so at a community level, these challenges faced by renters, particularly in regional areas, and the challenge in remaining in a rental or finding a suitable rental nearby, it can end up contributing to a loss of connection and social capital in regional towns. And we know that from research that social capital, it's a very important protection against future disasters. And this also means that we're missing opportunities to build back better at the household level. This could mean putting in more fire-resistant materials or raising the home above flood levels, because renters don't have the ability to make these changes or influence the rebuilding process. So there's just two ways in which these challenges faced by renters can impact on our resilience at a community and a societal level, and why it's so important for renters and for the whole community to ensure renters have adequate rights in relation to disasters and the ability to exercise those rights as well. So thank you. I'll leave it there, and please feel free to get in touch if you'd like to find out more about our disaster resilience work at VCOSS.
Thanks so much, Lucy. A very informative start to this event. We're so grateful for your time to really set the scene for us in terms of who is at most at risk in disasters and how this intersects with renting. So thanks again, Lucy. It's now my pleasure to welcome Amanda from Gippsland Lakes Complete Health. Over to you, Amanda.
My name is Amanda Howard and I'm the Team Manager of Emergency Recovery Support at Gippsland Lakes Complete Health. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I work and live, the Gunnar people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Disasters significantly impact the lives of all those they affect. Houses, community infrastructure and crucial services can be damaged or destroyed, and residents of rural communities can find themselves in situations where accommodation is threatened. The Emergency Recovery Support Program has witnessed these impacts in many different forms. One such form is individuals and families who are renters rather than owners of residential properties, and the unique challenges faced by them following a disaster. I'd like to discuss renting and disaster and some of the things we have noticed in the Emergency Recovery Support Program. Having secure accommodation is a necessary condition for human safety, and likewise, in the aftermath of a disaster, having stable housing is a vital part of the recovery journey. Residents who are displaced from their homes can struggle to move forward if they are left wondering where they are going to stay immediately after the disaster. This is a problem that's faced by all individuals, regardless of whether they are homeowners or renters, as disasters do not discriminate who is affected. And therefore renters are impacted by the disaster as much as homeowners, but in some ways more so, as renters generally don't have control over the repairs following the disaster, and they often don't have insurance to cover their belongings. So the issues faced by renters in the aftermath of a disaster, which has displaced them, can therefore be unique and complex. Some of the things we have observed are the lack of self-advocacy. Our experience from multiple disasters has been that renters are reluctant to ask for repairs through rental providers and property owners for fear of repercussions that may arise from doing so. These repercussions might range from inconveniences, such as being ignored or waiting longer for repairs, to more severe outcomes such as rent increases or evictions. The latter case is a particularly difficult issue we have observed with our clients who are renters. We have worked with renters who attempted to self-advocate by requesting repairs through the rental provider or property owner, and have been asked to vacate the property so repairs can be completed, but they've got nowhere to go to. We have also worked with renters who requested repairs only to be served with notices to vacate following a rental provider or property owner's refusal to comply. We have worked with renters who were told by rental providers and property owners that they must pay for the repairs themselves, only to be evicted once those repairs have been completed. This is a common issue faced by renters, even outside the disaster space. As such, renters will often not advocate for themselves following a disaster, and nor will they allow someone to advocate for them due to the fear of the repercussions. In the case of eviction or rental increases, the outcome is the same, further financial hardship. A rent increase places further financial strain on households already suffering under the cost of living crisis, while eviction requires a renter to search for a new property, often within the same or surrounding communities where the rent is almost guaranteed to be higher due to both the ongoing cost of rentals and the scarcity of available properties in the aftermath of the disaster. Another issue is their lack of understanding of the tenancy laws and their rights under these laws. The law provides clear protections for the renters, but our experience has been often that renters are not aware of their rights under the Rent Tenancy Act. This lack of literacy can have significant repercussions for renters as it makes it difficult for them to confidently self-advocate and exercise their rights in the aftermath of the disaster. We have also observed renters fall victims to actions on the behalf of rental providers and property owners that are not aligned with the Tenancies Act. Such actions have included some of the things we've already said, such as incorrectly declaring that renters are responsible for paying for repairs to the property. However, further actions have also been observed, these including refusing to carry out repairs in certain timeframes, delivering communications in correct formats, and serving notices to vacate that do not adhere to the Tenancy Act. Renters who do not have thorough understanding of their rights are therefore at risk of suffering in the aftermath of the disaster, as they might not realise that what is occurring is not aligned with their protection under the Tenancy Act. The other issue is the availability of housing after a disaster. Many individuals, both renters and homeowners, will face their accommodation being threatened as a result of the disaster. Homes can either be damaged or destroyed, requiring residents to live elsewhere while repairs take place or new accommodation is found. Fortunately, housing becomes a bigger issue than it already is in the aftermath of the disaster. The availability of rentals is reduced as a rental property is both vacant and otherwise may be damaged or destroyed and therefore no longer suitable for prospective tenants. And this availability can also be strained by an increase in demand both from displaced renters who are seeking new rental properties, but also from displaced homeowners who require a rental property to reside in whilst repairs or rebuild is occurring of their property. Rural communities are commonly the most severely affected when a disaster occurs, and rental properties in a rural area may already be low in availability. Disasters compound this issue due to the previous mentioned reasons, making it difficult for renters to find new accommodation when they are displaced. The rental crisis has resulted in a lower availability of rental properties despite high demand. For this reason, rental property prices are often prohibitively high for those on low incomes and or affected by the cost of living crisis. The situation is no different for disaster-impacted renters who face even lower availability of properties in rural communities. Our team has worked with clients who reside in locations where properties may be available but for unaffordable prices, making it difficult to find stable accommodation. So in summary, the key issues faced by renters recovering from a disaster are self-advocacy, tenancy law literacy, and availability or affordability of a property. In reflecting on the issues faced by renters in the aftermath of the disaster, we can consider what actions and supports can be both of assistance. Our team's recovery support workers have been able to assist clients who are renters by linking them to other services that operate under our community health organisation, including the homelessness team, the family violence team, or counselling services. Outside of our organisation, we have worked with providers to offer support through homelessness programs, financial counselling, and community legal supports. These services help to respond to the demand and issues in the following ways: by providing advocacy for renters to help enforce their rights, even where rental providers may try and discourage renters from doing so, increasing literacy and understanding of their rights under the applicable laws to help the tenants understand, to know what their rights are, and to defend against actions taken by rental providers. and facilitating the search for new and affordable rental properties through private rental assistance programs that can utilise resources such as an interagency relationship and bond loan applications. It is necessary to acknowledge, however, that these supports are not sufficient to fully overcome the issues discussed. One example is a renter whom is evicted from a disaster-impacted property that a rental provider intends to sell instead of repair. A tenancy advocacy program can help extend the notice period to provide more time for the renter to find new accommodation, but it cannot stop the rental provider from deciding to sell the property because the renter has tried to enforce their rights by requesting repairs that the provider is unwilling or unable to implement. Another example is the availability of rental properties. Private rental assistance programs can help renters find properties in their local area that they may not be aware of, or helping them to secure the new accommodation when displaced due to disaster. But if there are simply few or even no properties available, a private rental assistance program will be severely limited in what supports it can offer. Public housing is a potential solution for some residents, but in many cases it is not a suitable one. Even with priority access due to disaster impact, waitlists can be prohibitively long, or available properties may not have facilities or infrastructure in place to support the residents with unique needs, such as a disability. Stable and secure accommodation is not only necessary for human safety and fulfilment. For many, it will be the first step in their disaster recovery journey. This is especially so for renters who often face unique issues when they are impacted by disasters, specifically in their self-advocacy and literacy of tenancy laws. Further impacts, including the struggle to find new accommodation in post-disaster community compounded by the rental and cost of living crisis, can also be observed. Referrals to support services can assist renters by helping them access a greater range of rental properties and improving self-advocacy through education of renters' rights under tenancy laws. Renters can benefit from being linked with support after a disaster, assist them with temporary accommodation if available, to liaise and advocate for repairs on a property, and to ensure that they are not residing in unsafe housing. Despite these supports, renters can still face these issues and struggle with recovery after a disaster. For further assistance is needed following the incident of a disaster to aid renters and other impacted residents with finding affordable, stable accommodation as the first step in the recovery journey. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda, for your presentation. This really drives home the unique challenges that renters face following a major disaster and the critical role the community sector plays in the recovery journey in terms of assisting renters to exercise their rights, but also access the necessary forms of community assistance that renters may need to recover. Really great to get a sense of what's in scope. And now, finally, I will throw to Kate and Anna from Arc Justice for a legal deep dive.
Thanks, Deb and Amanda, for inviting us along, and for VCOSS team for having us. I'm Kate Clossy. I am the Director of Strategy and Impact here, and this is Anna Dorovich. Anna's one of our managing lawyers and takes care of our housing justice team. Arc Justice comprises the Loddon, Campaspe and the Goulburn Valley community legal sectors, and we began with a housing advocates service 25 odd years ago, which was now known as Housing Justice. We work on the Dja Dja Wurrung lands. We also work across Taungurung and Yorta Yorta countries, and I'd like to just start by paying respect to elders past and present, and to acknowledge the incredible power of work and advocacy that those countries and clans do across these lands to continue and to grow and to fight for the rights for their people and their culture. This is unceded territory and continues to be, always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. These are floodplains that we live on, work on. Those floodplains have nourished and cared for those cultures since time began. The waters that fall, that create floods, that create disasters, only create them because of the way that we have used that land. The injustices that are formed are all about how we've organised our societies and how we build our communities. So I just always like to remember when we're talking about disasters that nature lives and breathes around us. And yes, we have had an impact on that, and we make in those experiences of those extreme weather worse. But it is the way that we use that land and the way we look after each other that can create the injustice. And so Arc Justice, as a community legal based organisation, exists so that we can try and limit the amount of that damage. And a big part of what we do is working with communities so that they understand their rights and so they can choose and have agency over taking action to have access to those rights. The floods that hit our communities, the little slide there in front of you shows the map of central and northern Victoria where we work. There's 13 local government areas. 12 of them were impacted by floods, and the 13th was sandbagging. The devastation was horrific. And I know for us was quite a little community legal centre, pair of legal centres. We didn't really know where to begin, but it came very, very clear that the only way we were going to get to the legal needs that were emerging was through partnerships with community service organisations like those that you're all working in. We couldn't get to every individual person. There was no way that was going to happen. It was tens of thousands of people who were impacted in our catchment. A lot of them had legal needs, everything from how to access social security, perhaps they've been knocked back for that, what to do with documents that were missing, and how to navigate often help structures that they have never navigated before, what to do with insurance. Kind of everybody thinks that they know something about how to respond. And so a lot of what we would do was trying to be that source of truth, that source of credible information. And what we couldn't do, because we couldn't be everywhere, was to make sure that partners like you all had some quick ways of thinking through problems to understand if there was a legal issue and to perhaps find ways of connecting people into some legal information that was going to help them. In particular was those legal issues that impacted renters. And what happened with renters often happened really, really quickly in the first instance. And we are still having renters that are coming to us today who are seeking help for the first time because of issues with their property that are flood related. Anna's going to talk to you a bit more about that with all of her expertise with the team that she leads.
Thank you, Kate. So I've been asked today to talk about the protections that are afforded renters under the Residential Tenancies Act. I'll call that the RTA for ease, which is the piece of legislation that sets out obligations and rights for renters and rental providers. I think it's important to mention at the outset that this piece of legislation doesn't actually grapple with the topic of disaster preparedness or disaster response. And this is something that climate conscious lawyers have been turning their minds to for some time now. And if time permits, I'll return to this at the end of this presentation and talk about a couple of reform ideas that are floating around in this space. But even though the Residential Tenancies Act, the RTA, doesn't contemplate disaster specifically, it does contain protections that your organisations should be aware of, which can really help renters when making tricky decisions before, during and after a disaster, particularly around whether or not to stay in a rental property that's been impacted. And our organisation, Arc Justice, as Kate mentioned, exists to ensure that rights are known and acted upon. And if there's really only one thing that you take away from the presentation today, I'd like it to be a simple awareness that organisations such as ours exist, and we're here to help renters navigate the myriad of legal issues that can arise when a disaster hits. We can also help your own organisations as you help those impacted community members with secondary consultations. So if you're looking, say, for general procedural information that doesn't refer to a client's specific circumstance, don't hesitate, give us a call. And as with previous renters' rights rundown sessions, the information that's provided in today's session is not a substitute for legal advice. So if you or the people that you're working with do need legal advice about a renting issue, please get in touch with our service. I also want to give a shout out at this point to Tenants Victoria and Justice Connect. Both organisations have put out already a raft of really helpful information online, toolkits and checklists to help renters and service providers such as yours in assisting renters to navigate their options under the Residential Tenancies Act. For example, Tenants Victoria has published a really helpful what to do next checklist for renters facing disaster, which you'll see there on the screen. This is a simple 2-page plain English document with key tips for renters, including what to do if renters need to leave quickly in a hurry. For example, take important ID documents with you, take medical prescriptions, financial documents, insurance policies, and also to understand their legal rights before handing back their keys, to report and document damage that occurs, and to seek emergency accommodation and legal advice. The purpose of my presentation today is to really deep dive into that second tip, to understand legal rights before handing back keys, which is probably one of the key lessons that we learned after the October 22 floods.
One of the lessons that we learned very, very quickly is that often tenants are given a notice to vacate in those very early days. But we know timing can also be really important. So what happens once someone gets a notice to vacate?
I think one of the things, we learned in the October 22 floods was that many renters didn't realise that when they get a notice to vacate, they don't have to leave by the date specified on that notice, but they can in fact stay and challenge that process. And I think a takeaway from this session for your organisations should really be to let renters know in the face of a disaster that if they are told to leave, they can pause, they can assess their options, they can get advice. There is a proper legal process that has to be followed for a rental provider to lawfully evict a renter, and that process doesn't happen immediately. It takes a little bit of time. And when a renter does stay beyond a vacate notice, and notice to vacate, it then becomes a matter for VCAT to determine whether or not the notice to vacate that they were served was valid, and whether their tenancy should come to an end. And I think when people are faced with a disaster, they're often experiencing trauma, shock, distress, and having that time to take stock of the situation and get information, get advice is really important, can actually see them making better decisions.
Yeah, and it's an environment where there are a lot of decisions to make and a lot of people are experiencing that trauma. But there's also often not a lot of houses to go to. And so your decisions that you need to make might be a bit different than they would be in an ordinary circumstances.
Yeah, that's right. For example, what we saw in the 22 floods was that a lot of renters were told they had to leave because their properties were deemed uninhabitable, and they acted on those notices. They upped and left. But in actual fact, it might have been possible for some of them to actually stay exactly where they were, not with access necessarily to the full property that they were renting, but part of it that wasn't damaged, or setting up a caravan in the driveway. And we did have clients who did that, who stayed in their rental properties, albeit with reduced amenity of those properties. But for them, there were other benefits to being placed, to remaining in place.
Yeah, it's really important often to maintain your connection to the community, because those people who are experiencing that trauma with you are often your people that you know how to get help from, or they're the people you are helping as well.
Yeah, that's right. I think what I'd like organisations to really take away from this presentation is that when a renter is told they have to leave, get advice, find out whether or not the way they've been told they have to leave is valid. We did see people get all sorts of notices, text messages, emails, phone calls. That's not a valid notice to vacate. A notice to vacate has to be on a prescribed form. You can see that up on the screen now. It's available on Consumer Affairs website. The notice has to set out the reason for which it's being given, After a disaster, a common ground might be that the property is uninhabitable. So it's not fit, the condition of it is such that it's not fit for human habitation, or it's been destroyed to such an extent that it's rendered unsafe, or it might be that a rental provider wants to undertake reconstruction, renovations or repairs, or perhaps needs to demolish the property. There are a raft of different reasons, and those reasons have attached to them different notice periods. One of the things that's worth bearing in mind for renters faced with a climate disaster is that ground to vacate for a property being deemed uninhabitable has immediate effect. If a renter receives that, the notice can lawfully tell them that they have to leave the day that notice is given to them. That doesn't mean, however, that they actually have to leave. What I mean by that is the notice to vacate itself doesn't authorise enforcement action. Rental providers who want to evict a client or a renter from their investment property have to follow a proper process. They issue the notice to vacate. If the renter overstays beyond the date that's specified on the vacate notice for them to leave, they then apply to VCAT for a possession order. VCAT hears the matter, so parties are notified of the hearing. Might be a phone hearing. Not all hearings are conducted in person. There's still plenty of hearings that are conducted by teleconference. And at that hearing, VCAT will determine whether or not it's reasonable and proportionate to end the tenancy, to give the rental provider back possession of their home. And it's at that stage, in a way, that the tenancy lawyers and advocates can really add value to help sustain a renter's tenancy. And we're grateful for the Victorian government's reform back in 2021, which added this reasonable and proportionate requirement to possession order hearings, because that's really the point at which we can argue that the impact of ending a tenancy for a renter, especially one that's been disaster impacted, could be catastrophic.
Yeah, so that time that just gives everybody a chance to pause. You can take photos. You might have to work out what's salvageable about belongings instead of having to almost abandon them if you were to follow that notice as it says right on that day. And then people like Anna might write a letter to you or get in contact to someone like yourselves to say, can you write a letter saying why this person is connected to their community? Because even though that caravan in the front yard might not be as luxurious as using the whole property, that connection might be so important for the well-being of that person. And that is an option, and it just gives everybody some time to explore those options.
So we've discussed what happens often in the aftermath of a disaster is that renters are told with very short notice that they have to leave their rental property. And we've also talked about the fact that they don't actually have to leave. They can possibly stay longer beyond their vacate date, and then that will catalyse the lawful process for eviction, which involves the rental provider applying for a possession order, having that matter adjudicated by VCAT, and if they're successful, a possession order is granted. Even at that point, a lawyer and advocate can negotiate for extra time. Under the Act, you can get up to 30 days of additional time before a warrant that's purchased can be executed. And all of that time can be really helpful for a renter to sort of take stock of their situation, salvage their contents if there's anything that can be salvaged, and take steps to find alternative accommodation. So that's where we are at the moment in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. If a renter, however, does stay, and perhaps the possession order application process doesn't even happen through negotiation with their rental provider, they've been told that they can stay in the property, the next step along this journey is negotiating for repairs. When it comes to repairs, an important thing to remember is that it's the rental provider's responsibility, not the renter's, to undertake the post-disaster cleanup and repair. This should be an obvious statement, but after the October 22 floods, we actually had situations. I remember very vividly a client who reported flood damage to her community housing provider's nominated maintenance person, who was then told via text message to rip up sewerage-soaked carpets herself. Now, fortunately, this particular client was really uncomfortable doing that and didn't agree to do it and instead sought legal advice. But this sort of thing can happen when people are suddenly confronted with significant damage, and it's possible in a small country town as well that the rental providers themselves are grappling with damage to their own private residences.
And everyone around is cleaning up theirs too. So it's all sort of feels like it's a bit of an all-in, but the risk and the responsibility does sit with the landlord, the rent provider.
That's right. And repairs under the Residential Tenancies Act is urgent and non-urgent, with different timeframes for when those repairs should be carried out. Urgent repairs have to be done immediately because essentially they make a property unsafe or difficult to live in. These include serious flood damage or storm or fire damage, essential service disruptions such as to gas, water, electricity, any structural defects or damage that make it unsafe or insecure. That would include things like black mould, rising damp. If a renter needs urgent repairs, they're often told just call the agent or the nominated maintenance person and lodge your request. We would always advise renters to follow up any phone call with written correspondence, put it in writing. It's really important to do this because if the rental provider doesn't respond in a timely way, you've started that paper trail to show that you've done what's possible to rectify the issue immediately and in a timely fashion. And that's also important if down the track that renter's got a right to claim compensation for the lost amenity of their property. For non-urgent issues, if a rental provider doesn't take action, a renter can give them a notice requiring repairs to be carried out within 14 days. In contrast, for an urgent repair, if a rental provider doesn't respond or address the request, the renter, if they're able to, can actually arrange for and pay for a tradesperson to come and carry out the repairs up to $2,500, that amount, and that they can then seek a reimbursement for that amount. I think, though, there are challenges when a region is impacted by a disaster, because often in that circumstance, the delay isn't necessarily attributable to any fault on the part of a rental provider. The reality is there are suddenly thousands of properties that are damaged and requiring significant repairs, and that blows out the time frame, the wait times for tradespeople to come and attend to those repairs. In these situations, a rental provider may offer a renter a reduction in rent to account for the reduced amenity in the rental property while repairs to the property are being carried out. We, as a community legal centre, we would strongly encourage renters to seek legal advice before agreeing to any rent reduction. And the reason for that is that the agreed reduction might well be treated down the track in the future as an agreed form of compensation, such that the renter can't actually claim any more. And the amount agreed upon may not actually contemplate the time the renter has spent liaising with tradespeople, the increased utility bills that they're paying. For example, if they've got industrial heaters running 24/7 in the property to dry it out, and they're paying for the electricity for that, that can be a significant increase for them. And also just the lack of privacy with people coming and going off their property. So there's a lot to consider. And I think at the time, when a renter is perhaps offered a reduction in rent, it might seem like a logical choice to say, absolutely, I'd love to take $20 off. But actually the inconvenience that they're suffering and the distress and disappointment, these are more significant than that. And with some legal advice, they might be able to actually negotiate an amount of reduction that really adequately compensates them for the impact that they've experienced. And it's probably worth noting as well that the RTA, it's a low compensation jurisdiction. I mean, renters can only claim up to $40,000 of VCAT, and rarely do we see compensation claims succeeding in that upper end anyway. And importantly, for a renter to actually claim compensation as a result of a repair delay, the rental provider has to be at fault in some way. The rental provider may not initially be at fault. For example, we mentioned before when, there are huge delays.
So many people
needing help, lack of tradespeople, and possibly the rental provider has lodged a complaint with their insurance provider, and that complaint has progressed to AFCA, the Ombudsman for financial disputes, including insurance products. And those sorts of delays aren't necessarily the responsibility of the rental provider, but that can change. And there's a point at which it's unreasonable for a renter to continue to live without any remedy for the state of their property. Compensation claims are cumbersome. They do require quite a bit of evidence. If your organisations are working with renters in the aftermath of an accident, it can be really helpful to help them document their damage, also to document the steps they took to mitigate the extent of that damage. It might have been that, for example, prior to a flood, renters elevated, put things in plastic boxes, up on tables or higher shelves. Take photographs of that. It's really good evidence that you did all you could, or a renter did all they could to minimise their losses. And as I mentioned earlier, keep a really good paper trail of correspondence. We see so often, especially in a regional context, that renters themselves become responsible for liaising with the tradespeople that are actually carrying out the repairs, rather than those communications happening with the rental provider directly. I would suggest you tell your clients to screenshot those conversation trails, those communication trails, and send an email so they're stored, they're archived. That way, if anything happens to the phone, there is still a record somewhere of the effort and time that your client went to help essentially progress the repairs to the investment property that they're living in. I should mention as well, just this month, VCAT launched the new Rental Dispute Resolution Victoria, RDRV, which is a free service to help renters and rental providers resolve disputes. And going forward, many of the compensation claims that we see will now be mediated at first instance through RDRV. And look, it is designed to be accessible and informal, but it is still very new. And as with any process or dispute resolution process where there is an inherent power imbalance between the parties, we would always recommend that renters get advice before they sign a settlement agreement.
Yeah, hopefully it will be easier, but records, evidence, photos, all of those things are really important.
So in terms of law reform and advocacy in this space, Tenants Victoria and the community sector more broadly are exploring opportunities to amend the RTA to increase protections for renters in disaster-affected properties. Current renting laws, as we've discussed, failed to address challenges for renters after disasters, which often have significant and lasting impacts on renters and also the communities that they're a part of, particularly in regional and rural Victoria, where a lack of affordable housing means that renters who are given notice to vacate have to leave town, relocate altogether. So introducing an alternative renting law framework to apply for disasters could help renters to either stay or return faster, benefiting not only them, but the communities that they form part of. Some early ideas, and these are just very, very early ideas, to increase protections for renters in disaster-affected communities include clearer rules on terminations, evictions, repairs and payments, introducing processes for independent inspections and assessments to determine safety, habitability, repairs and fair rent adjustments, a right to rent reductions based on property damage, cooling off periods for reinstating tenancies that have terminated, and first right of refusal for previous tenants. And finally, a right to place lease obligations on hold pending the outcome of insurance claims following a disaster.
So that's it from us. Thank you to VCOSS again for having us, and thanks, Hannah.
Thank you.
So that's it for today. A series of really great presentations. A very big thank you again to our guest presenters, Lucy Mann from VCOSS, Amanda Howard from Gippsland Lakes Complete Health, Kate Clohesi and Anna Dorovich from Arc Justice. If you'd like to continue the conversation about disaster resilience and the communities that you work with, great news. If you don't already know about it, you can sign up to join the VCOSS Disaster Resilience Network. There's plenty of information, including an online form to join that network on the VCOSS website. So if you go to vcos.org.au and go to our renters' rights page, you'll find a sign-on form for that VCOSS Disaster Resilience Network. That network meets every 2 months, and it's a fantastic space for workers in Victorian community sector organisations to discuss key learnings and best practice in disaster resilience, a space to share upcoming reports, consultations, events, fantastic peer learning and collaboration space. So please join up, become involved, and keep continuing the conversation with us about disaster resilience and the communities that you work with. Want to, as we close out this webinar, give a big shout out and thanks to the Department of Government Services and the Victorian Property Fund. So our friends and colleagues at Consumer Affairs Victoria. Our Renters' Rights Rundown events are made possible with their support. So we're very grateful for them enabling us to do this great work with sector. I'd also like to thank you, all the viewers of this Renters' Rights Rundown event, and all our stakeholders whose insights continue to shape our sector communications on Victoria's renting rules. And finally, I'd like to thank the VCOSS team, Ella Longhurst, Amy Houston and Damien Kavanagh. Thanks so much for joining us today, and look forward to our next Renters' Rights Rundown webinar. Thank you.